Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think we're still waiting for a couple of our speakers to arrive, so I'll keep an eye on our participants and make sure everyone arrives. So, welcome to the digital launch for Gender Justice in the Law, Theoretical Practices of Intersectional Identity. And thank you to our 13 contributors and 7 panelists today, and to all of our viewers for joining us in this celebration of the contribution to law, culture, and the humanities series. Today, we'll hear from several panelists and conclude with a collective toast to the book. So thank you for joining us. Please note that I'll be recording this Zoom session so that those who are unable to attend today can watch it later. And also, if the session comments exceed our hour, please know that you can email me for a copy of the recording, especially if you need to leave before we finish. Also, please mute your microphones unless you are intentionally speaking. Now, gender justice is a subject that I am personally really passionate about. And I appreciate that today's session is also a chance for me to learn, listen, and hear from the experiences of the other panel members, as I am so pleased to use this forum as a good ideas exchange. As I was thinking about how to organize this session, I reflected on our collective awareness of this issue and considered to what extent society at large is invested in gender advocacy. Then it occurred to me about the underlying causal mechanisms, or what causes inequity and what to do about it. So finally, in the context of themes addressed in the book, I'd invite the panelists to raise potential solutions or policy recommendations, or maybe social movements to address how we can all work together to try and combat this rise, for instance, in violence against women. And again, as I mentioned privately to the panelists, be free to not directly address questions that I posed, and please be free to not worry about what I'm saying. So just say whatever you want. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Caroline, whenever you're ready, just let me know and I'll begin your introduction.
I'm ready, whenever you're ready.
Okay, awesome. Let me just check. Yep, we are recording. Okay. Caroline Joan Pickart has an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, Christ College in the UK, with honors as the Sir Run Shaw Scholar and Wolfson Prize winner in Philosophy of Science, a PhD from Pennsylvania State University in Political Philosophy with doctoral minors in Comparative Literature and Aesthetics, and a joint JM cum laude with certificates in International and IP Law, and an MA in Women's Studies as the Tybal Spivak Fellow from the University of Florida Levin College of Law. She is the series editor on Law, Culture, and the Humanities at Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, an adjunct professor of law at Florida A&M University, an attorney practicing in criminal, family, and property law, and a former professor of philosophy, humanities, and film. Her research interests are in critical race theory, IP, criminal, international, and property law. Caroline?
Going ahead and unmuting. So thank you so much, Elaine. And it's truly an honor to be here to virtually meet and hopefully converse with all of you. I understand that Elaine would simply like me to give a few words about the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press series on law, culture, and the humanities in order to ground how the edited collection that is to be toasted today fits into that particular series. So I prepared a very short PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen. Somehow the share a screen function, there it is, okay. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, that's fine. Somehow the share a screen is not working. So let's go ahead and I'll just talk impromptu. Now, there are certain links that I would have had up. The first of which would have been the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press website itself, which features
Caroline, can you see if I've made the requisite changes and it might be available as an option for you now?
Okay, let me see. Yes, I believe it now is. So let me see if this
Sorry for
works.
that delay.
That's okay. Zoom is always
I want to see your PPP.
Not that it's a great deal of work. Okay, so this is it very briefly, and this is the link that should work once I hit slideshow view show. I can't seem to start it. Okay.
Slideshow is one of the options in the top. You were very close to it with your cursor a moment ago.
Okay, yes, but I can't see it right now because there's another thing on top of it that is preventing me access to it. So if I can, yeah, for whatever reason, I cannot get access to the slideshow. Anyway, the links are not active. So let me just go ahead and, unless there's a way of, nope. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move ahead because I know we're on a very tight schedule. So the link would have led to the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press website on the law, culture, and humanities, not literature series. And it is one of 10 series that FDUP hosts. It's actually one of the youngest or the newest since it started in 2015 under the directorship of Harry Kayishan when it was in the located in the FDU Greater New York or New Jersey area before it moved in 2017 to Vancouver, Canada, where it is now under the directorship of James Gifford. So the vision of the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press series on law, culture, and the humanities is that it looks at interdisciplinary fields of humanistically oriented legal scholarship. Now, by interdisciplinary, most people think, well, if it's interdisciplinary, then it must be kind of mushy or not quite well defined since it works in between well-defined subject areas, but actually I have a higher standard for interdisciplinary scholarship because it means that you have to actually be able to talk across different worlds, to dance across different worlds. If you're going to quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, and to be able to liaise effectively using different tools, different language games with different communities of scholars and still sound coherent, convincing, and effective in your arguments. So some possible topics include legal history, legal theory and jurisprudence, law and critical cultural studies, law and anthropology, law and literature. And in fact, the original series was simply on law and literature before I took it over. Law and film, law and society, law and the performing arts, law and communication, law and philosophy, and of course, legal hermeneutics. And I would say that gender justice in the law would probably fit several of those categories since it is a hybrid as an edited collection. So it would probably fall into legal theory and jurisprudence insofar some of the key texts are actual cases or statutes, for example. It could fall under law and critical cultural studies. It could fall under law and society. So there are a number of categories that the particular edited collection would fit. Now, the the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press is a co-publishing partner with Rowman and Littlefield. So in fact, Fairleigh Dickinson University Press functions essentially as the, if you wish, the acquiring partner, and anything dealing with scholarly review, because it is a fully scholarly series, that is, it takes very seriously this process of vetting proposals and book reviews, rather book proposals and fully completed manuscripts. In some cases, some of the proposals deal with conference proceedings that might have the possibility of being expanded into full monographs, or edited collections are also entertained. So the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press handles the scholarly vetting end of it, and Rowman and Littlefield, again, whose link you would have seen over there, handles the publishing and the production end of it, because they have a much more developed staff and are very efficient in terms of both production and publicity. So that's how the two work. And to close, the Fairleigh Dickinson University Press series in law, culture, and the humanities has, as of late, published 18 books. And there are actually several books that do discuss the issue of law in relation to gender or sexuality, although Elaine's edited collection is the very first that really puts it up front and center in terms of its theoretical framework. So on that note, I promised Elaine I'd stay within about 5 to 7 minutes, and I've kept my promise in spite of the PowerPoint related snafus.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Ann Bartow, who is a professor and director of the Franklin Pierce Center for Intellectual Property at the University of New Hampshire. Her scholarship focuses on the intersection between intellectual property laws and public policy concerns, privacy and technology law, and feminist legal theory.
Well, thank you very much. I'm actually not the director anymore. That was laid up on the website. I did actually try to correct that, but I know you had a lot going on. I stepped down from that at the end of June. We do have a new fabulous director. The program is still going on strong. I'm happy though, because as probably many of you know, when you're an administrator, even part-time, you don't have 5 minutes to yourself. I never expected writing to be so hard when I got interrupted every 5 minutes for 5 years. But it was a good learning experience. In any event, I'm a law professor and I teach at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm usually pretty involved with the American Association of Law Schools organizations. I was a section chair for the intellectual property section. I've been the section chair for the privacy and defamation section. And I've been active, although never in the leadership of the women's section. And the reason I bring that all up is every year, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of us. She was a law professor and she used to come to conferences. She wasn't like ever too good for us. She was always one of us. And she was one of the people who was going to the women's sections meetings, I've heard, because I wasn't there, when there were like 6 or 9 women in legal education. They used to meet at some tiny closet near the boiler room because they wouldn't even give them a real place to meet. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg stayed very loyal. And so at some point, the section decided to give her a big award, and then to name the award after her to give to people thereafter, people who really deserved the recognition. So this year's awardee, I finally get to my point, was Kimberly Crenshaw. She's won the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Award, and she's really the person we have to look to really articulating the idea. I know other people were kind of working toward it, but she's really the person who brought intersectionality to a place where we could really appreciate, understand, and adapt it. So I can't say enough how much I feel like I owe her personally, opening my eyes. And I think this whole volume, oh, sorry, right, the whole section, the book probably wouldn't exist without her. So I just want to make sure that she was mentioned and got a lot of credit. So I think the book is really interesting. It's a great project. It really gives a wide variety of perspectives on important issues. I think that one of the things that always stupefies me to this day, maybe even more as I age, is how gendered everything is. in life and how unnecessary it is about 99.9% of the time, that there are a few little points of the things that we really, still need to think through and haven't quite worked out, but 99% of the time at least, there's no reason, like the identifying a gender is ridiculous. And every time I sign up for anything, if you sign up for a magazine subscription and they want to know what your gender is, and then if they're progressive, then in choices instead of male or female will be male, female, or prefer not to say. Like people are still obsessed with gender. I don't think that's going to change in my lifetime. So I think that I know certainly I've had to kind of work through that in different ways, both personally and professionally. I think that we all are going to have to do that, and especially in our scholarship sometimes. And I think that this book is going to be a useful tool, a very useful tool to help us do that, to help us situate gender. And from my perspective, and I know not everyone's going to agree with me, but for me, it's like minimize gender in many, many contexts, that the focus on pink and blue and what boys do and what girls do, and the expectations around genders are just so present everywhere. Academia is one of the few places where we probably talk about it, right? So most of the people in the room are like, what does she know? Yeah, this is all real basic stuff to us, and I'm sure it is, but I think this book isn't necessarily for all of us. It's for people kind of moving in that direction. I think it's a book that could easily be the basis for a seminar. I don't know if it's planned to be a textbook, but I think it really could be. And the one thing I guess I'd point out, I don't want to be a party pooper, but it is a little expensive. The book's a little expensive. That's the one thing that's always a struggle. My area of law is intellectual property law. And one of the things I've been able to do is to find, to try to find textbooks which are a little bit more affordable for my students. So just as a future thing to think about, I guess I will put that out there. Maybe if the move, toward ebooks where you don't have to worry about paper and publishing and delivery and some of the expenses with a book and ink and paper book, maybe that can be addressed. But just generally, I think it makes a great contribution. After the George Floyd murder, some of the issues are really more important than ever to think through, issues of power and issues of privilege. And as a person who grew up, one thing I talked to my students about, and I guess my family, and just to kind of generally think about myself, is where you wind up, and where you start in the world and where you wind up. I personally was born, I'm white, I've been white my whole life, and I was raised in a really racist environment. It's a racist culture. I mean, not my family particularly or my community, but I mean, just like the racism that you've grown up with is not, you can't escape it. It saturates the culture. And so there's some point where, and so what I always tell my students is like, that's not your fault. Like, you didn't pick where to be born or how to be born, or the fact that the culture you're born into is saturated with racism is not your fault. But at a certain point, you have to take responsibility for identifying that, realizing that, and figuring out how you're going to respond to that. And that's like the lifelong project. And I think this book is going to be really helpful in that project. Thanks.
Well, thanks for that really thoughtful response. I appreciate it. I hadn't considered moving the text into a seminar, but I really like that idea, and I appreciate that. Cameron Pontiff is our next speaker. Hi, Cameron. Cameron is a Louisiana licensed attorney who focuses on civil rights research. He is also an LLM candidate at UCLA School of Law with dual specializations in human rights and law and sexuality. He publishes widely on issues related to LGBTQ+ reproductive rights and the intersections of race, mental health, and mass incarceration. Thanks, Cameron.
Thanks, Elaine. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to share your success with the publication of your highly relevant book. From the outset, I found that your book could not have come at a more important time. I believe in today's political climate, important issues get lost in the cacophony of misinformation and consequently go unnoticed, especially issues related to gender and sexuality. Thus, your book provides helpful and relevant insight into the current political and legal landscape of gender and sexuality. Specifically, I found that your selection and organization of essays really highlight key aspects of the dynamism and multifaceted nature of the human identity, while also demonstrating how the law fails to recognize the same through its perpetual adherence to these androcentric ideologies in politics and policy. As a lawyer and student of human rights and law and sexuality, I found that your book encompasses multiple facets of gender and sexuality and addresses prevalent issues facing sexual minorities specifically. I really appreciate Cheryl Lynn's use of a multi-axial analysis of discrimination and how she tackled the rigid normative understanding of sex as a fixed binary trait. It seemed that it could be easily extrapolated to other areas of law that rely upon these biological categorizations of sex. One of my areas of interest is same-sex couples' ability to access artificial reproductive technology. Through my research, I discovered that many states bar same-sex couples from entering into gestational carrier agreements, which is just a surrogacy contract, because such laws adhere to strict notions that intended parents of these agreements must provide both their gametes to effectuate the child. So in other words, these persons have to be opposite-sex couples. So as such, I believe that your book really focuses on that your book has a cogent grouping of gender identifying analyses that has the potential to be a viable resource for advocates, scholars, and even policymakers themselves to not only proffer a new understanding of sex and gender, but to rationalize gender and sex beyond their biological traits. Moreover, the portion of your book focusing on how policing bodies reinforce gender and sexual essentialism illuminates issues that I believe plague both our national and international institutions. For example, as discussed in Rebecca Smith's essay, a multitude of civil society organizations embrace the violations model to understand sexual and reproductive health rights, which obviously works to infantilize women and sustains the misconception of women as the victim subject. Thus, after reviewing your collection of essays, I found that each highlight important aspects of how national and international institutions operate on these misperceived notions of sexual and gender essentialism, and ultimately contributes greatly to the area of scholarship. So in closing, overall, Elaine, I'm positive that gender justice in the law will serve as a guidepost for scholars and advocates to propel the cause for equality and equity, and to serve as salient frameworks for reconfiguring the relationship between gender justice and the law.
Thank you so much, Cameron. I really appreciate those comments, especially with regard to Smith's essay. I know that was one of the points that she was really trying to hone in on, and it seems that in that way you picked up on it and succeeded. I really appreciate that. Okay, we'll move along. Kristen, you're up next. Kristen Calzadia is a Miami Law Public Interest Fellow. She brings extensive experience with Title IX law, both from her experience as a teacher and from legal internships with Miami-Dade County Public Schools and the National Women's Law Center. Following law school, she pursues a career in education, law, and policy.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Elaine, for inviting me to speak here today. I learned so much about gender justice from this book. It was incredible, and I've never read anything like it. It's so, there's just aspects of intersectionality and gender studies that I had never even considered before reading this book, so it was a really incredible learning experience for me as well. And I'm just really excited there's so much important academia and legal work going on at this crucial time in our nation's history. I personally have had a keen interest in working towards a more equal society for women since my time as an undergraduate history major at the University of Miami. To fulfill my history major, I was required to take 2 graduate level history courses. I took both courses on women and gender studies. These graduate level courses opened my eyes to the many centuries of policies that were intended to hold women back in society, from the history of female property rights to the history of the welfare state and its racist and sexist implications. In these classes, I learned firsthand that the policies and legal remedies of yesteryear were far from equal, but that the vestiges of such policy were still affecting women's equality even today. I've spent much of my law school experience working on behalf of gender justice for young girls and the LGBTQIA community. It has been a great privilege and honor to work towards gender equality, but it has further reminded me of how far we still have to go to truly achieve gender justice and equality. When I worked for Miami-Dade County Public Schools in the attorney's office, I predominantly researched how courts interpreted Title IX rules in ways that would relieve the institution of all liability. This is understandably the role of the government when it's a defendant, right? They want to avoid having to pay damages just as any defendant has the right to do. Yet it's difficult to read the case law on the subject of Title IX litigation. An overwhelming amount of school systems and college institutions are relieved of all liability, often for legal technicalities that really just illuminated the real issue with Title IX policy generally. The odds of jumping through all of these legal hoops is unlikely for anyone to do, but in an especially cruel way, it's made even more so for these young people whose trauma made the long process of constantly talking about their sexual assaults and rapes that much more grueling and re-traumatizing. It was not uncommon for students to drop all charges in an attempt to move on from constantly reliving the worst moment of their lives over and over and over again, even if it meant that they would do so without any justice or repercussions for their perpetrators. I already believed that Title IX policies were more harmful to survivors than helpful, but things took a turn for the worse last summer during my time working in the Education and Workplace Justice team at the National Women's Law Center. My team at NWLC, I was part of the Department of Justice for Student Survivors, along with several other major nonprofit legal organizations and universities, sued the Department of Education and former Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, seeking an injunction to stop the administration's proposed Title IX rules from taking effect. The rules themselves were egregious for survivors, removing critical protections, creating unfair investigation and hearing procedures, including re-traumatizing live cross-examinations, and not granting any meaningful relief for survivors who were harassed or assaulted off campus, which, as many of you probably know, is extremely common. For example, like at frat houses or things of that nature. If you if you were assaulted at a frat house, that now relieves the school of any liability. Or if you reported to the quote unquote wrong person. So you used to be able to report to anybody who works at the university who's considered a reporter. And now that that's no longer the case, there's only very specific people that you can report to for Title IX purposes. And if you don't report to that person in the correct amount of time, then there's likely not going to be any liability for the school. We spent weeks speaking with survivors, editing their stories into statements for the court, and attending litigation strategy meetings to figure out the best arguments to make when seeking this injunction. In the end, the court did not grant the injunction, and this case is still in litigation. I'm hopeful that the new administration will repeal these new promulgated rules and reinstate better protections for survivors. 2020 was a difficult year for women in many ways besides these new Title IX rules. The pandemic sparked a rise of domestic violence against women and children. Obviously, the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Senate's approval of the Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, who wants to overturn Roe v. Wade, and in many ways is very antithetical to RBG's legacy. It's a difficult moment for gender justice. Yet in some ways, 2020 ended on a high note for women. We have elected the first female vice president of the United States, as well as the first female secretary of the Treasury and the first Native American woman as the Secretary of the Interior. We have the most female and diverse group of the current Congress in history. And I'm grateful for all the women in Congress, in this new administration, in academia and the legal system, working to ensure that we not only continue to break glass ceilings, but we continue to strive for policies that protect survivors, ensure equality of the sexes, and create a functioning system of gender justice at last. Thanks.
Kristen, thank you so much. And thanks so much for your important work, especially as you were saying with Title IX. I know some of my experiences in the classroom at Bucknell, I got lots of earfuls about students' experiences with assault on campus, and how often they would just call the police versus reporting it on campus. And I know, like you were saying about Greek life and that significance there. Thank you.
Yeah, of
Our
course.
next
Thank you.
speaker is Paula Tavares, who is a senior legal and gender specialist at the World Bank Group. Her work focuses on promoting gender-informed policymaking, improving the legal framework protecting women from discrimination and gender-based violence, and enhancing women's economic opportunities. Paula is a Brazilian lawyer and holds a master's degree LLM in international law from Georgetown University Law Center and a specialization in international relations from the University of Brasilia, Brazil. Regionally, her work focuses specifically during the past decade on sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Paula?
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me and see me well. I do want to start off by just quickly mentioning the important contribution I think the work is to the field of gender justice in general and the promotion of gender equality, which is what I focus on. Also thanking the previous speakers and commentators for relevant insights. I'll briefly mention kind of that I'll discuss this in the capacity of my work and my expertise as a legal and gender specialist, mostly working in comparative research of gender equality in legislation, assessment of the impact of laws and regulations on women's empowerment, and more specifically, women's economic inclusion. And then just quickly, kind of how this is approached with the World Bank, within the World Bank, and the practical aspects of the work, and how this, the important contributions can also help the work that we're doing more at the practical level, at the policy making level, and gender-informed policy. So at the World Bank, we do have research work on gender equality, looking again at comparatively laws that promote or discriminate against women or promote gender equality. There is work within the World Bank and in its practical engagement with countries in projects and operations, in making sure and looking at how the work that we do can, for on one hand, inform policy making, but also have practical applications in closing gender gaps. And so a lot of the work that was discussed in the book and the contributions are really helpful to kind of supporting some of the specific aspects that we look at, but also providing better evidence and analysis to how to close these gaps. Some of these bring some new approaches to things that we're already looking at, and others kind of contribute by providing additional analysis and maybe new insights on this. So I'd mentioned, three of the pieces that I more specifically looked at. So I, looked at, for example, mostly under praxis and policy, which I think is the connection with the work that I do mostly. And then the first piece by Daz, and how it provides important insight into issues of access to rights and justice and implementation issues regarding the law. And that's often what we look at. So beyond the enactment of laws, the removal of discriminatory provisions, which is part of a big part of the work that we do, but then how to make sure that this translates into access to justice and access to rights for women, for example, right? And so there's often insufficient analysis and data on this, and case studies about what are the barriers in when complainants, or women in this case, seek justice. And so a lot of the contribution from that piece goes to some of these aspects and provides concrete insights into how justice systems actually perpetuate patriarchal systems and continue to uphold, even if unintentionally, entrenched biases towards certain groups, mostly minorities, excluded groups, and particularly women. And so this adds to the knowledge, and also to the way we can have evidence to approach the work in guiding better informed, gender-informed policy making, and also the implementation of legislation. So that's kind of one one aspect. Then I also looked a little bit more closely at the second piece, losing custodial mothers in child support reform. And it actually addresses an important piece of the work that we do. And when looking at gender barriers to women's economic inclusion, a key one has to do really with the disproportionate responsibility that women take in childcare, right? And how that connects to the large amount of unpaid care work that women do, and how that leads to time poverty for women, and consequently less capacity and opportunities to earn income and to join the workforce. And so it was really interesting to see from that analysis and the perspective looking at custodial interests and interest supporting custodial mothers' interests can be included in reforms, and how some of the policy making that we look at could also consider some of these aspects, right? And understanding that a lot of the reforms and solutions often do have male-centric views, and how some of these areas of legislation and policy making can also help better redistribute childcare responsibilities, which is one of the key areas of our work, and something that we hadn't considered in terms of this type of legislation. We've mostly looked at, for example, leave policies, so maternity, paternity, parental leave, but also childcare, government provided childcare. But this it just kind of provides an important and interesting aspect to also consider. And then lastly, I just quickly touching upon the fourth piece, which looks at Title VII, and how a lot of and this is of course the specific example from the US, but more broadly, how this can apply to policy making, not only when in many countries we're still looking at removing explicit discriminatory provisions from laws, but then also promoting and supporting the adoption of non-discrimination legislation. And so looking at some of these specific aspects that are addressed, and how some of the considerations of binary-based, sex-based discrimination laws do not necessarily fully cover and support the wide range of different groups and underprivileged groups that should be addressed. And so in this type of policy making and advising gender-informed policy, these are also important aspects that we can take into account when looking at the adoption of laws. So just kind of from the practical aspect, I think that's what I was asked to comment on. But more broadly, the entire work, the entire book, and the different chapters all have very important parts and contributions to the practical and the kind of policy work that we do. And so this is very helpful. And thank you again for the contributions, and looking forward to more of the discussions.
Paula, thank you so much. I love to think that this text helped inspire some of the research for World Bank Group in the future. Okay, Leanne Francis is our next speaker. Dr. Leanne Francis is an associate professor of African American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the College of New Jersey. She holds a PhD in United States and African American history, an MA in US and world history, and a BFA in painting and illustration. Leanne's unpublished book manuscript titled Jane Crow, Injustice, Race, Crime, and Punishment in New York State, 1893 to 1916, analyzes the intersections of gender, race, and class by exploring crime and punishment and labor and community through the lens of Black women's experiences, while offering comparisons with imprisoned US-born and European immigrant white women. Thank you, Dr. Francis.
Thank you, Dr. Wood, and everyone for being here. Like the previous speakers, in thinking about what I would say today, I started with the question of, why is this book important, and how is this book important? The book is important for many reasons, but I'll talk about two. It's important because of history. the book goes beyond an excavation of the past. Its contributors recover suppressed and untold histories. Its contributors reconceptualize historical narratives, interpret historical events in new and rich ways. This book is also important because of this moment. It offers explicit and implicit commentary on this moment. It's a reflection of this moment. Its contributors propose analytical frameworks for understanding and acting in this moment. To concretize the book's importance, I turn to its broader thematic, beginning with the organizing theme, gender justice. Gender justice as it is envisioned, pursued, thwarted. The book scholars propose gender justice is possible where the vision and pursuit of justice is intersectional, feminist, and therefore accounts for gender diversity and centers vulnerable populations, including Indigenous women in conflict with the law, poor mothers that are disproportionately Black and women of color, intersex, trans, and non-binary people, disabled women who are also disproportionately Black and women of color, and the world's poor, whether it's poor people in colonial Ireland, the Dalit women of India, or colonial and post-colonial Tanzanian women. On the point about the intersectional feminism, the intersectional feminist conceptualization and application of justice and justice work must be, as contributor Lisa Lincoln says, of Dalit Women's Testimonial, it must be self-reflexive. It must be defined by self-interrogation, no matter our social location, no matter the extent of our marginalization and the multiplicity of the oppression that we experience. We must interrogate our relationship to systems of power and consider not just the colonizer outside us and outside our communities, but also the colonizer within. This creates the possibility of achieving justice. And the book's contributors construe justice, imagine and identify justice in breadth and complexity, in traditional ways as it is supported and denied in laws, public policy, legal systems, and by legal officials, and in non-traditional ways as the laws or norms perpetuated in language systems, or as an archive of historical, national, political, collective, and individual lived experiences. So that addresses the history and the book's thematic. I want to talk about this moment and how the book is important, why it's important in this moment. Like you, like all of you, we are living through a pandemic. And so as a scholar and person living through this moment from a position of privilege in that I'm in the United States, PhD, working professor, my income, et cetera, and so on, to understand and analyze its impact, the impact of the pandemic, we must use an intersectional feminist framework. And when we do that, it spotlights the disproportionately severe impact the pandemic has had on poor, Black, Indigenous people of color, women of color, disabled people, elderly people, and people at the intersections of those identities. I am going to pause for a moment and I'm going to say, I have twin 7-year-olds. You might hear them screaming. And of course, they're listening to me and they're loving every moment. But you might hear that. You might see them. Okay. So this intersectional framework allows us to evaluate the extent of gender injustice, for example, and the extent and severity of gender injustice under the pandemic and pandemic conditions, such as the greater rates of illness, the greater rates of death, unemployment, eviction, homelessness, and mental trauma that poor people, Black, Indigenous people, people of color, women of color, disabled people, elderly people, and people at the intersections of those identities, the extent to which they endure those. All right. And they endure these populations, these vulnerable populations are suffering these conditions and surviving these conditions due to a variety of structural factors. And just a few of them, the mismanagement in the domain of political leadership in this country, a mismanagement by a white, male supremacist, colonial, capitalist, pseudo-democratic state that has eroded over decades the social safety net, cut social services, made healthcare inaccessible, and the unsafe, but also the unsafe practices of not an exclusively white, but largely white populations that subscribes to Trumpism. And through an intersectional self-reflection based, or rather an intersectional self-reflective infused feminist lens and approach, we can address and stem the current health crisis. As a historian of African Americans whose teaching and scholarship is preoccupied with Black resistance and white supremacy as it operates on an ideological, at an ideological and institutional level, the book also, I recognize the book's import in analyzing gender justice as it operates and through and is pursued through social movements like Black Lives Matter. The movement was born in the U.S. It's now a global movement against police terrorism specifically, but and also systemic racism more broadly. Systemic racism against Blacks in particular, but also Indigenous people and people of color, especially those who are poor, queer, and disabled. It is a Black liberation movement. Black Lives Matter is a Black liberation movement that has a relationship, that is in relationship and opposition to not just a white supremacist state, the one that we exist under, but also a mainstream white liberation movement, which is really a white supremacist movement. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about, and I know you know this, but I'm not just talking about self-identified or self-declared neo-Nazis, self-identified white nationalists. I'm talking about the average white person that voted for Trump. So there's this mainstream white supremacist movement that manifested in the Capitol riots last week. So the book provides a blueprint for for understanding gender justice, pursuing gender justice, and creating the possibility of achieving gender justice. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for those thoughtful remarks. Really timely context. One of the things I was thinking about when preparing for this session was whether or not, to what extent to acknowledge the current political scene. And thank you so much, Leanne, for mentioning that. Our next speaker is Tuba Syed. I'm not entirely sure if Tuba is here. I did receive an email from Tuba around 1 a.m. She's in Pakistan, and I think she suspected that the launch was about 12 hours ago. So I'll just pause here, and if Tuba, you are here, would love to hear from you. Otherwise, that concludes our speaker panel. Thank you to our speakers. And now one of our volumes contributors, Kristen Mulligan, is going to say a few words before our final toast.
Thank you, Elaine. Really quickly, just once again, for everyone's reference, I'm going to drop the discount code and the link to the Roman website and information for those of you who would like to purchase the book as either an ebook or a print volume, just there again, so it's readily available in the chat. It's right there. And just for accessibility purposes, I'm gonna post now I'm going to give you a moment to refer to that information if you need to copy it. And then before Elaine concludes, I want to thank all the speakers, the contributors to gender justice, and especially those of you who came to support our launch. We are deeply grateful. And for purposes of accessibility, I'm going to post all my remarks now. So they're in the chat for those of anyone who needs a complete text. I want to take a moment to offer a toast to Elaine, our fearless, brilliant, and judicious editor, for all her dedication and effort in putting together this volume and helping with this event today. I know I speak for all the contributors when I say we would have nothing to celebrate, much less such a wonderful, insightful collection, without her continued hard work and perspicacity. Cheers to you and gender justice, Elaine. Everyone raise your glasses. Cheers to gender justice and to Elaine.
Thank you so much for your kindness, Kristen. I plan to toast several times, which equals several sips, which I'm fine with. Thank you.
All right, and now I'm going to put myself back on mute so Elaine can speak.
Okay, and I think Caroline had a few words before she leaves as well.
Okay, just a few quick things to piggyback on the toast. I really would like to celebrate the edited collection, as it is indeed a valuable and timely addition to the series. And I know that, having worked on several edited collections as well, that it takes an incredible amount of dedication and patience and kindness and professionalism to bring everything together harmoniously and in such a timely manner, especially during a year of the pandemic, which slowed everything down. So that's an amazing achievement for all of you, and especially Elaine for orchestrating everything so seamlessly. I'd also like to add, since I noticed that Greg Klingham is there, who's the University Press Director at Bucknell, that I'd like to thank him very much for connecting Elaine and me in relation to this particular book proposal, which of course James and I, who's the director at FDUP, were quite excited to have it and are indeed very proud to have this edited collection as part of the series. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I appreciate that too. Yes, of course. I think Greg's speaking, but I'm not hearing you clearly. Does anyone else hear Greg? Try again. Well, it's Alvin and the Chipmunks. I'm sure Greg is very pleased. He's my mentor from my master's program at Bucknell. And in fact, gender justice and the law emerged from one of our many conversations about what needs to be written. Greg said to me, if you walked into a bookstore, what would you need to see on the shelves? And this volume resulted. So thank you very much, Greg. And thank you again so much to all of our volumes contributors and to Caroline Pickard, our senior series editor, as well as the editors and staff at Fairleigh Dickinson University Press, as well as at Rowman and Littlefield. Special thanks to the Irish IP, Kristen Mulligan, for helping to organize this event, and to Dawood Majnoon, to whom the volume is dedicated. Thank you to Rudy Affelbaum, 4th grade class president, who reminds me to be brave and to do crossword puzzles in ink. And to Abigail for her endless creative expression and beautiful energy in this world. And now I'd invite you to raise our glasses again, or an invisible version if you aren't near one at the moment, to the launch of our volume, Gender Justice and the Law. Cheers. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And have a great weekend and take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Elaine. Well, job very well done. So honored to be a part of this incredible edited collection. Thank you.